we are learning chapter 4 of the Legacy Tshuva, which is a powerful text on what we call tshuva, which is return. In this chapter, chapter 4, we are examining what a soul really is. What a soul really is. And that's because to understand going back to our best self, we have to know what that best self is. What that best self is. So in the first 3 chapters, we went through some of the technical aspects of tshuva, some of the definitions of return, of what we've just gone through in the high holidays. And now we're going through the spiritual side of tshuva, which, as we said, is the hay returning, the hay returning. And if you remember, the word tshuva actually is tashuv hay, the hay will return. So the word tshuva, return in Hebrew, stands for, as Zohar says, a hay is being returned. And which hay, as we said, it is the hay of the divine name. And we'll go through again a little more of the visuals for those who like visuals. But right now I wanna go back inside the text, and we're starting to look at how our soul is an extension and a mirror of the divine name. How our soul is an extension and mirror of the divine name. Last class we learned that when the entire world is being created, and I say created because by Kabbalah, creation is an ongoing process. This is not a big bowling ball that was set into motion however long ago. It's right now being projected onto time and space and even consciousness. And even time, space, and consciousness are also being created ongoing. So it's an ongoing creation. But when God creates all the worlds, God does it through what medium? Speech, right? So God says, let there be light. God says, let there be a firmament, etc. And God's speech is the active force that creates the worlds and keeps them in existence through a system of letters and all kinds of crazy things we get into. We won't today. When God, when God caused our soul to enter into us, that was a different process. It was not speech. The Torah said God did what? Blew, right? So as we know, when we blow from deeper within us. That is the Torah's way of telling us, your soul, it's different than everything else. Everything else is God speaking. That's superficial. That's less internal to myself. I can speak for a long time. If I were to blow, that comes from right inside me, and it takes a lot of energy. So our soul is actually an extension of God's own name, God's breath, whereas the rest of the world is just God's speech. We're going to go deeper into that so we can really see from all angles how that is so, because that is the process by which we understand, A, what happens when we do an avera, what happens when we do something counterproductive, and what we affect or even rupture, and B, the incredible impact it has when we do tshuva and return to our real state, which is the state of a soul that is an actual piece of God and being conscious of it, and the effect we have. And both are so much more than we would imagine just from thinking ourselves as people that maybe do right and wrong and have a little scorecard in heaven. It's nothing like that. It's far, far more impactful and much more spiritual. Let's start again, chapter 4. We'll just review a little bit. We're at the bottom. Go ahead, Eleanor.
Bottom of page what?
214, the key.
214. Hold on, let me make sure. I hope this is the bottom of the key.
Yeah.
The key to this will be found in the phrase, for God's people are part of God.
For God's people are part of God. That is the mission statement of this chapter. That is the thesis of this chapter. And we might think this is just being poetic. Oh, we're connected to God, we're part of God. The Alter Rebbe says, no, this is literal. This is literal. The rest of the world, that's God's speech. And my speech, it comes from me, but if you record my speech and then throw it in the fire, I don't say ouch, right? My speech is not me. However, if something is a part of me, my pinky, which is a part of me, and you take that and you throw it in the fire, I say ouch, and I pull it back. It's me. So the Alter Rebbe says, this is literal. the Jewish people, your souls are an actual part of God, not God's speech, not creation. They are an emanation from God. And that is going to have major impact on how we see what happens when we lower ourselves or when we reconnect ourselves to our essence. And as I said, we're not talking about neshamas as we experience them day to day, right? So I wake up in the morning, I'm crabby, I'm whatever. I'm not always conscious of my soul at this level. This is the soul as it is in heaven before it came down, and we can reconnect to that essence. We can be aware of that essence. We can also just have a normal everyday essence. And so you can't walk around thinking whatever thought I have, that's God's thought. Not at all the case, right? My normal mundane consciousness is probably not at this level, which is why we want tshuva. Chelet mishem havaya baruch hu. Go on with, my gallery got moved around. I think Linda and then Paula. You want to unmute on one of your devices, Linda, not both.
Apparently my microphone is not working on one of my things.
I had a similar morning with my camera. I got you.
I know, I saw that.
Yeah.
Hold on one sec. You know what? Skip me this time.
Sure. Paula, why don't you go ahead? And we'll do the whole top together. They are part of the 4-letter name.
Oh, actually, I can do it.
Oh, good. Go ahead.
They are part of the 4-letter name of God, thus describing.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Thus describing God's infusion of a soul into the body of Adam, it is written, and he blew into his nostrils a soul of life. And as the Zohar comments, he who blows does so from within him, etc.
Excellent, excellent. Next, we'll go to Paula, and that is what we're reviewing. That we want to learn to see ourselves as a direct extension of God, not, God forbid, that means that, all my narishkeit is somehow is justified, but to say that what I do has an impact because I'm actually a piece of the divine name. And so I want to see myself inside as a holy place. I want to see my thought, speech, and action as a holy phenomenon. And I want to approach it the same way I would approach coming to a high holiday services here. I put on my best clothes, I'm my best self, I behave properly. If I woke up in the morning and as I encountered consciousness, I said, that's the same thing. This is a piece of God. I'd be at a much higher level. And so we're trying to figure out a way to get back to that by recognizing what we really are, a piece of God.
When we pass away, that piece of us goes back to God.
Yeah. When we pass away, that piece of us goes back to God.
Yeah, but sometimes you also said that sometimes the soul has to come back down to finish up what they have.
I think if we get into, it's a question about reincarnation. I think we get into that, we're gonna not get back to the subject of the class.
Okay.
But right now here, we're talking this perspective now. I'm a piece of God, and I can forget that, I can remember that, I can behave in a way that reflects it, or I can behave in a way that disrupts it. That's the key right now. Go on.
Now,
Yeah, Paula, go ahead.
now God has no bodily form and so on, God forbid. How then is it possible to say that God blew and to speak of a part of himself?
And Paul, let's go to the bottom. Af dibra Torah kishon bnei Adam.
However, the Torah speaks as in the language of men.
Ki kmo sheyesh hefresh vehevdel gadol b'adam hatachton, al derech mashal ben hahevel sheyotze mipi b'diburo lahevel hayotze al yedei neficha.
By way of analogy, there exists a vast difference in the case of mortal man between the breath issuing from his mouth while speaking and the breath of forceful blowing.
And he goes on and makes a point. The breath that issues with my speech is just minimal. That's a superficial aspect, but the breath when I blow is from deep within myself. That's the power, life force of the vivifying soul. And he's going to go on and say, the same thing applies to God, but it's so different that you can't really compare them. But at the same time, we're going to compare them. Right, so we're going to skip some of the text. We don't get, I don't want to spend 3 weeks on each chapter like we have in the past. That's the idea. And here is a big caveat that we always want to have, which the Alter Rebbe, of course, puts in himself. When we talk about us being a reflection of God and our soul is a piece of God, we want to make sure we don't start to imagine that God is somehow just a bigger version of us, or that when I blow, God actually has something like vapor that's coming out, or that if I have a sense of understanding that God is just that times something, no matter how big a number. So every time we enter into these correspondences to try and understand something about Kabbalah, something about godliness, we need to understand there really is no comparison. And as long as we keep that in mind, now we can compare. You know what I mean?
So would it be more beneficial, if we just think out loud, that in terms of the sphere, that we have them, God has them, and that's a reflection. So it's not really something physical, like a body.
Yeah, that's where we're going. We're going exactly there. The Sefirot are one of the maps we use to create a correspondence.
Right.
And when they're in God, we call them the Sefirot. When they're in us, we call them the Kochot, the powers.
Right.
And so here's what the Alter Rebbe is getting at is our whole soul, the structure of it, it reflects the structure that's emanating out of God. But at all times, make sure I keep in mind that you can't really compare, and he'll reinforce it again and again, because we don't want to get into a world where we think that somehow I got some bells going on.
Somebody's grandfather clock floating.
Yeah. Let me get the gallery. Okay, we got it. But we're going to go into it. But I just want people to understand, we're not saying that by understanding myself, I have any clue because God is so beyond that. It's like, the other day I stumbled on NASA has this solar system explorer, and I can even pull it up and show you. It's phenomenal. You got an entire map of everything we're aware of in the solar system, every planet, every microplanet, whatever they call them, every asteroid, the gas giants, the belts, the this, that, and you can pull something up and you see exactly where it is in real time in the solar system. You get the best picture we have of it. You can go around and you can zoom in and zoom out. It's amazing, right? And so I'm learning about the solar system. And I was wondering, how far out will it go? And so I zoomed out, and then you get to further and further. Eventually you see just the Milky Way. They stopped at that. I'm like, that's amazing. I'm looking at the Milky Way here. And I'm spinning it around this angle, that angle. Then I zoom back in, right back to the planet of Jupiter that I was looking at. It's the most amazing tool, right? Now, if I say, I was looking at the Milky Way on my computer screen, what did that have to do with the Milky Way? Could you even begin to compare that to the actual Milky Way? Right? It's about as close as you can get to infinity in the real world, right? A little bit of light, a drawing on my computer screen does not compare to the actual galaxy, which is unimaginably beyond unimaginably big, right? So if you were to try and find a correspondence for how little this map we have actually relates to God, that might be the best one I could think of. And yet even that, because the picture on my screen had some amount of light and was a few inches across, it actually does compare to the Milky Way, because you could multiply it by a very large number and it would now be that size. So there still was some nth degree of comparison, whereas with God, there's absolutely no comparison. So you can't compare any number to that. But to try and get into our heads how little this really does compare, you might use something like that. Have I driven this home enough? Okay, let's go on then. Precisely so. Kacha. So we'll go a bit to 216 in the middle. Kacha mamash al derech mashal hamavdil havdalot le'ein ketz. Precisely so in the analogy, allowing for the infinite differences involved between created and created. Yesh hafresh atzum meod lamala. Go ahead, Sue Ellen.
There exists a prestigious difference of truth between all the hosts in the heavens, even the spiritual being like the angels, who were created ex nihilo in the soul of man.
And let me do the Hebrew. Ben kol tzva shamayim b'afilu hamalachim shenivru me'ayin liyesh v'chaim v'kaimim mibchinat chitzoniut hachayut v'ashefa shemashpia ein sof baruch hu lachayot ha'olamot. They derive? You can go ahead.
They derive their life and existence from the external aspect of the life force issued forth from the infinite one to virtualize creation.
Right? And he's going in. This is not just the physical world, but also the angels, the spiritual beings, everything we've learned about in all these texts, that's all coming from speech, right? The breath of his mouth, which means speech, not the breath of my heart. And then it goes into the letters of the 10 utterances. We could spend some time on this, but this is just the idea that we talked about. Not just the physical world, but every single thing comes from speech. In contrast, 217, fourth paragraph, Uvein nishmat adam שנמשכה תחילה מבחינת פנימיות החיות, והשפע שמשפיע אין סוף ברוך הוא, כמו שכתוב, ויפח וכו'. Go ahead, Dan.
In contrast?
Yeah.
In contrast, the soul of man derives initially from the innermost dimension of the life force and flow issuing from the infinite one.
As in the verse, and he blew. So all this, the Alter Rebbe is driving home, our soul is a very special phenomenon. It is an actual piece of God, and it is not even created. And although I might look at myself and say, oh, I'm like everything else, I have a beginning and an end, and I have a size, I'm a created thing. If you look deep inside, you see there's an end to consciousness. There's sort of an emptiness beyond which there's this mystery. We're not aware of it. And what lies beyond that is this phenomenon that we are actually coming from God's breath. We're coming from something beyond what consciousness can connect to or relate to. And so it looks like darkness, but it's not the darkness of nothing. It's the darkness of everythingness, so to speak. It's that we're coming from an infinite place, and it's impossible for us to relate to that. So it looks like darkness.
Cantor, we can't hear the readings on the Zoom call.
Okay, well, let me turn the mic up. The mic is pretty high, so let's just, yeah, move the bag.
Yeah.
Move the bag, we'll yell. See if that helps. And let me, just ping me if you can't, and I'll repeat it. And then it descends more and more through the divine utterances. Let's not go too deep into that. And the angels are called Elohim. It's another proof. So let's skip to now the soul of man, right? So we're on page 219. And one thing we want to understand going into this is that the divine names have qualities. The divine names have qualities. So the main name that we use in Judaism is that four-letter name, Yud and He and Vav and He. You often hear that as being described as the most transcendent name of God that we know, right? We call it Havaya in this class. It's kind of a Hasidic way of saying it without saying it. Some people think that means that name Havaya, that is God. It's the most transcendent name that we equate that with God. It's no more equated with God than my name Michael is equated with me. It's a way my soul connects to my body. It gets to my essence, but that's not me. I'm something else, right? If there was only one human that lived on the earth, would they need a name? I don't know, right? They'd still be themselves, whether they had a name or not. So our names, they refer to us, they connect to us, but that's not who we are. The same thing applies to God's names. That most transcendent name we have, that's because that's the name that began the process of creation. From nothing to something, the beginning of everything, that all comes from that name, Havaya. And you can see it in the spelling. It's from Hoveh, to be, which it would be He, Vav, Vav, He in modern Hebrew. But it's the word Hoveh with a Yud in front of it, which is like doing something, right? You know, Yivarech is to be blessing, right? So if you put a Yud in front of Hoveh, now you get continuous existencing, right? And that is the name, that is what that name does. That is the name that keeps everything, all of creation, spiritual and physical, in continuous existence. It is God's force of bringing nothing into something and creating anything that could be called a creation. Above that, there's God without names. And God's essence, which is far, far above that name, is something else entirely. But there, God doesn't need names because a name is how you relate to something outside of you. So although the name Havaya is the most transcendent name we have, understand that that's not God. God's essence is above that. And then below the name Havaya, we have all these other names. And what are they referred to? Once there's a creation, now God is interacting with creation, so to speak. And so when God is limiting creation, that's the name Elohim, right? When each of the different names, like we know the name Shakai, I'm going to call it, that's protecting and limiting. We write that on the door, Shomer Dotot Israel. Each of these names of God is just another behavior of how God interacts with creation. That all happens once creation has happened, and that's the name Havaya. So in general here, we're going to use the name Havaya and the name Elohim, because Havaya is creation, and then Elohim is the limiting of creation. And what's another way of defining limits creation has is nature, right? Water freezes at this temperature and is liquid at this temperature and is vaporous at this temperature, right? So those are limits. That's a limit on how cold liquid water can be, how warm liquid water can be. We just call that nature. Why is it that water freezes and evaporates at a certain temperature? It's nature. It's right. It is. That's the name Elohim, which has taken the light coming from Havaya and said, okay, if we're going to make Mayim, right, it's got to have freezing temperature, a boiling temperature, these properties, etc., and everything else in nature, the same thing. So the rest of the world is sourced in, if we're using this dichotomy, is sourced in the name Elohim, God's speech, God's limiting power. Our soul is sourced in Havaya. And we'll see shortly, if we have time today, and we've looked at this before, exactly how the Sfirot and the name Havaya map onto each other. So now we get into it. This is 219, Kanoda, there's a well-known statement. Kanoda mimaymar Eliyahu antu dapikat asar tikunin, v'karinan lahon asar sfiran lan hagav v'hon almin stimin v'chulu. Now go ahead, Stuart. There's a well-known.
I'm sorry, is that the but the soul?
No, this is 219, bottom paragraph.
There's a well-known.
And holler if you can. You want to show them where it is? Stuart?
Yeah. 219, under your phone.
Oh, thank you.
Move that phone.
There's a well-known statement of Elahu in the passage entitled Patah Elahu.
Eliyahu, yeah.
In the introduction to Kune Zohar, you are he who elicited the 10 tikkunim, literal garments, which we call the 10 Sefirot, by which to conduct the concealed world and the revealed world.
Yeah, a lot of stuff in here, okay? So there is a section from the Zohar that some nusach, some prayers have on Friday night, and you say the whole thing. It contains a lot of very fundamental Kabbalistic concepts. One of them is that God is the same, not changed, not divisible, and yet God emanated 10, put a word here, we'll call them Sfirot, here he calls them Tikkunim, 10 phenomena with which to conduct the world and run everything, so to speak, to which to interact with the world.
Like aspects or actions, in other words, the Sfirot are the different, like,
Aspects is better than actions, because they're not really acting yet. It's a tricky word, right?
Yeah.
Tikkunim means adornments, but we also call that garments. Sphira, the word comes from Evan Sapir, which means a shiny stone. So there's somehow these luminous emanations, but they are 10 ways that God interacts. So if God chooses to interact with kindness, that's chesed. If God chooses to interact with strength or restraint, that's gvura. But we haven't divided God up, right? God's just one. So there's a mystery of how God could emanate 10 Sfirot when God is indivisible. And that's something for another class entirely. But here we have them. You're not allowed to worship them, right? They do not separate God, right? They're not different parts of God. And yet in godliness, which is all one, God, who is omnipotent, is able to emanate these 10 expressions without changing God's unity. So
like a parent, depending on what the situation is, can be angry, fostering, funny, whatever.
exactly, right. And a child might think so. The comparison was to a parent, and one day a parent might be the one who says you have to go to bed, and a child says, "No, this is mean, parent." And the next day the parent says, "Here's a birthday cake," and says, "Oh, this is loving, parent." And the next day, the parent says, we're going to the dentist. And this is a mean parent, but we know it's all love. Like we're all caring for the child. We're doing what's best for the child. To the child, it looks like it's a division. But the wiser person knows it's all mentoring, it's all nurturing, it's all love, right? So here, similar thing, but many, many degrees more separated. And then we have this concept of concealed worlds and revealed worlds. I'll mean steaming, says here. And just in short, the idea of a concealed and revealed world does not mean concealed from me and revealed to me in my stable consciousness, right? So it's not like the concealed worlds are called concealed because I can't see them, right? The revealed worlds are also highly spiritual worlds that most of us have no perception of other than the map of inner knowing, right? Which is a good compass. But what makes them revealed and concealed is like, we compare them to creatures that live in the water and creatures that live on land. Creatures that live on land, it's not apparent that they're connected to land, right? They walk around, they move, and yet their whole life comes from the earth, like growing, and the sun feeds them. And yet they seem to be disconnected from that. They seem to have their own entity, their own beingness, right? Creatures in the water are always surrounded by water. They're always floating in the water. They're connected visibly to their element. And even halakhically, if I'm using a mikvah, a lake, and a fish touches me, it doesn't disqualify that part of me. I still have been immersed in water because the fish is considered part of water halakhically. So the hidden world, those are beings, they're still completely nullified within godliness, and they don't have a sense of their own beingness the way the revealed worlds do, which are just lower spiritual worlds. But without going deep into that concept, none of them are worlds that you could just look at and see unless you're a very, very refined spiritual person. These are all the spiritual worlds. And here we go to God's attributes, right? Which are calling God's sfirot, and how they map onto our structure as a soul. So top of 220. Go ahead,
You are
Joe.
wise, but not with a knowable attribute of wisdom. You understand, but not with a knowable attribute of understanding, and so on. All the 10 sfirot are included and represented in their source, the tetragrammaton.
The tetragrammaton.
Tetragrammaton.
So let's pause our inside the text and let's look at something we've seen before, but it's worth reviewing, and that is how it is that the 10 sfirot are included, so to speak, in that 4-letter name of God, and also included in our personalities, keeping in mind, he says that there's an infinite difference, right? We have understanding, but that doesn't give us even a glimpse of what understanding is within the Ein Sof. We have chesed, we have love, we have everything, but we can't understand, we can't compare our version to God's version. That notwithstanding, it does give us a mirror to get something about that and connect in some way with that. So let me share my screen here. I'm sure this will not go awry because everything technical has gone so smoothly today. Here, so welcome. We're going to look at a very important key, which is how the 10 sfirot are included in the 4-letter name of God. And this is key for many, many Kabbalistic concepts. In this larger class, we're learning about tshuva. So we want to understand what our soul is, how our soul is a direct reflection of the structure of the 10 sfirot in God's name. And by understanding that, we'll get the impact of what tshuva really is, and also what, unfortunately, happens when we do an avera. So first we want to look at consciousness, right? As we see, and you can crowd around here if you want to have a look. If we see the soul as being a sort of umbilical cord from the bottom, time and space, right through up to the top, to the Ein Sof, we are connected in all of it, and it's almost like, imagine a rope coming from God down to our consciousness. But that rope, it has definition, and that definition comes out of what we call the 10 sfirot, which are the 10 emanations that come out of godliness. So if you break that rope up, so to speak, into 10 You can imagine them how they want, because your picture has nothing to do with the real thing. So none of these maps or structures really relate to the real territory, right? But they're a good way to imagine it. So each of these lines here represents one of God's attributes, whether it's chokhmah, inspiration, chesed, love, and they're all coming down through every one of these worlds. So if you picture in the bottom world of Asiya, which is time, space, and consciousness, if that's me, say, lying down, each of those attributes appear in me as I am down in Asiya, but also as I am in each of the higher worlds. And so here is a picture of how I would look, which each of those attributes intersecting my reality, my consciousness. And we're going to go through, just to remind people, we've learned the definitions of the Sefirot before. It starts with wisdom. Can I move this? Are you guys? I'm not sure if that's in the way for you. Let's put it over there. It starts with wisdom, then understanding, and then knowledge. So that is my intellectual attributes. God has chokhmah. Chokhmah is defined as the very first spark of any awareness of anything. Right? So before I have a new idea, before I'm exposed to something new, first I have to have the ability for that new thing to actually be manifest. But right when that new thing that's outside of me, or maybe deep inside of me, but not that I'm aware of, before it's manifest, there's a point where now it's able to be manifest, but it's not manifest yet. And that really appears as a point. It's like click, it's a light bulb flash. And at that moment, it's not manifest at all, but before that point, it wasn't able to be manifest, and now it is able to be manifest. So that can only appear as a point, right? Because if something has not yet manifest, so it takes no space at all, and yet it's able to be manifest when before it wasn't, that can only appear as a point. That's the nature of a point. That is the definition of chokhmah. And to connect to chokhmah, I have to be gone. I have to be absent. That's called bitul, right? So that first piece, chokhmah, God has chokhmah, we have chokhmah, you can't compare them. Understanding is now when I take that point and I start to enlarge it, so to speak, intellectually, so it has some definition. Now I say, it's an idea about this, and I can do all the cogitation. God has that, and so do we as a reflection. And dot is the ability to connect to that abstract concept so that I might have feelings about it, right? God has dot and we have dot. Then we go to
To name Bina.
Bina. Understanding is Bina. Thank you. Thank you. I went too fast. Then we have the next, we're going to call them 6 attributes. This is from Chesed down. And these are God's emotional emanations. And they also appear in us as emotional flows. Again, making the distinction that our emotions cannot be compared to God's emotions. The first is Chesed, loving kindness. The second is Gevura, strength. Third is Tiferet, compassion or beauty. Then Netzach, victory or confidence. Hod, acknowledgement. Yesod, foundation or truth. Goodness. And then those 6 form a bracket that we're going to look at together in God's name. But those are 6 emotions that once I have a connection to an important idea, now I start to feel things about it, right? I've never had a chocolate bar. I'm 2 years old and parent gives me a chocolate bar. That tastes good. Now I know about chocolate. I wake up the next day, I remember the chocolate and I have a feeling, or the feeling is, I want the chocolate. And everything is some version of that, right? I see the little squares on the wall as a child. I stick my finger in as I'm plugging it in, I get a shock. And now the next day I remember that and I have fear of that electric current. I don't understand what it is, but I remember and I have fear. And so it goes as we get older and we have love and awe about things, and we have confidence, and we have all these emotions. And then finally, it all comes out here, Malchut, royalty, right? Malchut is a sense of expression. Malchut is finally saying something, doing something. That is the 10 Sefirot as they are in God, and the 10 powers, kochot, as they are in us. Now I want to show you how those Sefirot map onto the 4-letter name of God, because that's what the Alter Rebbe is getting at in this section. It's not that there's these 10 Sefirot and they're their own subject. They're their own category. And if you learn Kabbalah, you learn about the 10 Sfirot. And what does it have to do with prayers in God's name? The 10 Sfirot are essentially the same as God's name. They are included in God's name. The two are expressions of the same thing. And now we'll go through and see exactly how we perceive that. So we talked about Chokhmah first. Chokhmah is represented by a Yud, right? If you were to give each letter a geometric shape, a Yud would be a what? A dot, right? Or we'll be more specific. We're going to say it's a point. A point. Because a Yud doesn't really need definition. I know it's got the little tail and everything, but compared to the letters, a Yud is a floating dot. It's not resting on anything. It's not connected to anything. It's a dot. And so here you have the dot of the Yud. And a dot, as we said, represents what of the Sfirot? Chokhmah, right? So the dot and the Yud are always Chokhmah. And you can even see it visually. If I were to draw a picture, I take my pen, I put it down on the page, and I haven't moved it yet. And what have I drawn? I've drawn a dot. And that dot could be what picture? It could be Chokhmah or what else?
The awareness?
No, I'm going to draw something.
Well, it could be anything.
I'm going to draw something, but I haven't started yet.
It's
It could go
potential.
down, it could, yeah, be anything.
It's potential.
So that means it could be what? When I go and draw, I could draw what at this point?
Draw a circle, draw a line.
Circle? Yeah. Anything else?
Anything.
Anything.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Anything you want.
I haven't started drawing yet. I put my pencil down. I've drawn, I know the dot actually has a shape now on the paper, but if I take that dot and I shave off as much as I can until there's nothing left, now I have a real point. Oh, but it still has some size. I shave off more and more until potentially I'm down to a point. I could draw absolutely anything at this point because I haven't started drawing yet, but I have touched the paper. I've started drawing. So that point, that represents the ability to draw absolutely anything that's on a paper. Same thing happens in life and consciousness. Beginning. So the beginning of anything in us or in God, it starts as a point, and that point is so powerful because it does not yet have expression. It can be anything, right? But now it actually has the potential to be a drawing or a concept. So it's gone from cannot manifest to can manifest, but can manifest anything. That is the Yud in the 4-letter name. But now there's certain things you need to do. One thing you need to do is take something that's in a lofty world and draw it, so to speak, down. Draw it down. So I need another function, another letter that's going to take this point and draw it down. Can you guess what letter that might be? If I take a Yud and I take it and I stretch it down, that's going to look like a Vav, right? We know. Oh, and a little side bracket. For those that know, dot and keter are really the same thing. I don't want to go deep into that. But whereas dot was the third of the intellectual flows in the chart of the Sfirot, in God's name, we actually flip up and we express keter. And keter is the little crown on top of the Yud. So that crown of the Yud represents not my first my first realization of a concept. It refers to the flow of desire and will that led me to fish for that particular concept. But Keter's up there if you want to know. And so if I take that point of Chokhmah and bring it down in whatever direction down means, right? Now I get a Yud, a Vav. And that, of course, is the 3rd letter in God's name, which represents taking something up high and stretching it down. So we have 2 of the 3 letters included in God's name because there's a Hey left. So if a Yud represents the point of something first being able to express, and a Vav represents drawing that point down. Now, before I draw a point down, I really need to expand it, right? Because I can't really use a point. A point is not usable. So what's the letter that takes a point, expands it first geometrically into a line, then expands it into a second perpendicular direction to make a plane, and then into a third direction to make an area, a cube? What would that letter be?
Hey.
Right, the last letter, Hey. Let's look at Hey and how Hey functions. Oh, there's so much in the Vav. I forgot one part. In the name of God, the Vav represents the 6 midot, the 6 emotions. What's the number letter of Vav to be beautiful? Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav. Vav is what number? 6. So Vav is the number 6, and it represents the 6 midot, which also are included, as you see here in the letter Vav. So Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, that's all in the Vav. And it really makes sense, because what are emotions? Emotions are taking something intellectual that is relating only to myself. An idea is just me with myself. And it's saying, now how do I feel about it? An emotion is how I relate to something outside myself, right? I have emotions about skiing. I have emotions about politics. I have emotions about food. I have emotions about people. Things outside myself elicit emotions. So my intellect is how I relate to myself. My emotions are now starting to relate to those outside me. And that is, so to speak, drawing down. If you have to leave, we started late, so if you have to leave, yeah. And finally, we have the letter Hey. And Hey represents expansion, as we said. So look at this letter, even just graphically. I start with that point, that Yud. I need to stretch it out so it expands into something. So I first stretch it one way to create a line, then stretch it a second dimension to create a plane. And then finally, the Yud represents even a third dimension where this square, this plane is coming up out of the page, so to speak. And so the Hey represents how a dot is expanded into 1, 2, 3 dimensions to become something with space, something with, in this case, intellectual breadth and depth that we can handle intellectually. And now we have something that the Vav can draw down, So let's finish just by looking at, finally, now this 4-letter name of God that we're familiar with. So when the Alter Rebbe says these attributes emanate out of God, out of God's name, and are included in God's name, it's literally letter by letter, each piece from every angle is representing how the function of these attributes work. The Yud, so first we have the higher 2 and the lower 2 letters. So the Yud Hey is the hidden worlds, and the Vav and especially the Hey are the revealed worlds. We have Keter, which is dot on top of the Yud. We have the point of Chokhmah in the Yud. Then that needs to be expanded, but still within God's intellect, which is this hidden world. So here you have Bina, which is the ability to take the point of Chokhmah and expand it to create, in this case, a divine intellectual concept, which is so far above our intellectual concepts, but we're a mirror of that. So you've got these 3 directions and this sort of intellectual breadth that's happening. Now that needs to be drawn down so it can relate to the revealed worlds, which, by the way, like we said, that's not the physical world that I see. The revealed worlds are revealed in that they have creatures that have definition and selfness, right? So there we have the 6 midot, which are the Vav. And finally, Malchus is the last Hey, and that is God's breath, which makes what sound? That's the sound of the Hey, right? And the Alter Rebbe will also point out that the Hey represents speech, which we have 5 openings in our throat, right? First the throat, then the soft palate, then the tongue, then the teeth, then the lips. So our breath is shaped by 5 organs of articulation, and that's how we make speech. And what is the number letter of Hey? Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, 5. I mean, and we could go on and on. From every angle, these Sfirot are exactly the same as God's name and are included in God's name, whether it's expression, whether it's emotion, whether it's the conceptual flow. And so you see, when we look at ourselves, we really are a precise map of God's name, and that reflects that we are, as we said, Chelek Hashem, we are an actual piece of God as the Jewish people. So when we come back, we're going to learn a little more about
Print that out for us and hand that out.
yeah, I can print. Yeah, there were people here that didn't see the screen, so if you're watching at home, you have a leg up on them.
Is there any kind of a midrash that speaks to the fact that the Hey has the space that then allows for everything to flow out of it? Like it would flow out and down to the Vav.
Yeah, there is midrash on that, and it's that a chet
Right.
is closed and chet is sin, and a Hey is open because the Hey is allowing the light of God to come in. So that's the main midrash as comparing a Hey to a chet, that a Hey is like a sin, but you've let God in, and now it's a different thing.
Yeah.
So that's a little tour on how the 10 Sfirot are included in God's name Havaya. I hope it's useful. And if you want to join us in our main class, please email Maya at temple-israel.org. We'd love to have you here at Gateway of Tshuva or learning any of our classes online. Take care and see you next time.